Welcome to the National Alopecia Areata Foundation's webinar, Patient Voices, Alopecia Areata Clinical Trial Experiences. Today, we're joined by members of the alopecia areata community, Brandy Meyer, April Noel, Sandy Kelberlau, and Katie Roberson, who will tell you about their journeys to clinical trial participation, along with dermatologist Dr. Tiffany Mayo, a principal investigator in many alopecia areata clinical trials. And I'm Lisa Anderson, Senior Director of Research for NAF. Before we start the webinar, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. We've disabled chat for this webinar session. Please post your questions for our panel in the Q&A section. Please keep your questions general for the benefit of all audience members. This webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a link to the recording via email. And finally, please share your feedback with us. At the conclusion of the webinar, a link to a short survey will pop up in your browser window. Please complete the survey there. This webinar is part of NAF's You Are Not Alone Education and Empowerment webinar series. NAF gratefully acknowledges the support provided for this webinar by our partners Eli Lilly and Company, Pfizer, and Sun Pharma. Now, before we start today's webinar, I'd like to tell you a bit about NAF and our mission. The National Alopecia Areata Foundation is the leading advocacy organization for alopecia areata. NAF's mission is to support research to find a cure or acceptable treatment for alopecia areata, support those with the disease, and educate the public about alopecia areata. NAF's vision is an empowered community with a choice to embrace or live free of alopecia areata. To learn more about NAF's support resources and research and advocacy activities, or to join us as an advocate or supporter, please visit our website at naf.org. And now on to today's webinar, Patient Voices, Alopecia Areata Clinical Trial Experiences. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and let our panelists introduce themselves briefly before we dig into their stories. So thank you all for being here today. If you could just take a minute to give us a quick introduction, your name, where you live, and your connection to alopecia areata. Do you want to start, Brandy?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me on here. My name is Brandy Meyer. I live in Southern Illinois, and my connection to alopecia is I developed alopecia when I was around 18 months old. I'm now 53 years old, so I have basically battled this off and on my entire life. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandy. And Sandy?
Yeah, my name is Sandy Kelberlau. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I developed alopecia in 2014 when I was 41, and it developed very quickly into alopecia universalis. And so I've been battling that since then.
Okay, thank you for being here too.
Thanks.
And April?
Hi, I'm April Knoll. I'm excited to be here. I live in Eastern Illinois. I work as a music teacher and a virtual assistant, and I was diagnosed at age 1 in 1977 with alopecia areata, and I've had mostly areata, but I was universalis from age 6 till about 8. So I'm excited to be on here this evening.
Thank you. And Katie?
Sure. My name is Katie Robertson, and I live kind of on the Illinois side of St. Louis. And I am a university faculty member here locally. I actually have a different connection to alopecia. My youngest daughter was diagnosed at age 6 and lost all of her hair over the course of a few months. And so this October will be her 4-year mark of alopecia universalis.
Thank you for being here as well. And Dr. Mayo?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Mayo. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I am also director of our clinical research unit, and I have overseen as the principal investigator of alopecia clinical trials. So I'm very happy to be here with y'all today.
Well, thank you as well. And thanks for all of you for being here, taking time to do this. I think it'll be really interesting for our community listening in to hear how you participated in clinical trials, what brought you there, and where things are for you today. So I thought maybe we would go in sort of order of when you joined a clinical trial. And so that makes you, Sandy, first by a couple of months. So if you could just take a little bit more time and sort of tell us a little bit more about your story and what brought you to a clinical trial.
Mhm. Yeah, so when I first developed alopecia, it was really, really sudden and totally out of the blue and unexpected. And I lost my hair so fast. I really thought that it would just come back on its own just as quickly as it had gone. So for the first few years, I didn't seek any treatment. I also had, read that universalis was tough to treat. So I knew that there weren't a lot of good treatments on the market at the time. But after about 6 years, I realized that it was not going to improve on its own. So I found a dermatologist, and at the time, I had heard about Xeljanz, and I knew that there was some success stories with that, with tofacitinib, which is the generic version. And so I went to my dermatologist asking her specifically about tofacitinib, and she said, "That's a great idea." But she said, "There's no way your insurance is going to cover it because it's not approved for alopecia. So let's try something else." So we started with methotrexate, and I did that for about, I guess about 4 months. I didn't have any response to that at all. And then we tried a topical tofacitinib, which helped maybe a tiny bit. I started to get just a little bit of peach fuzz maybe, but it wasn't something very significant. And honestly, thinking about it, it didn't really make sense. Like topicals didn't really make sense for universalis. So when I went back for a follow-up after that, she told me about a clinical trial that was happening at UNC, which was pretty nearby, for some new JAK inhibitors that were being trialed. And I knew at that point that I was very interested in JAK inhibitors. So I said, yes, sign me up. So she gave me their phone number. I called them. They got back to me right away. And they had a couple of different trials going on. They went through questionnaires to see which one or ones I might qualify for. And the one that was the best fit was baricitinib. And so I went for an appointment. They did a chest X-ray. They did an EKG and some blood work. And then after all those results came back fine, then I came back and I was approved for the clinical trial. And so I started in, I guess it was February of 2020. So it was on Valentine's Day of 2020. I remember that. And then about 2 months later, the pandemic hit. And then it was really up in the air as to whether or not the clinical trial was going to continue. And it turned out we just had to do a few virtual visits, and I had to do a few blood draws at a different location. But thankfully, it continued because I was having results and I really, really didn't want it to stop. But anyway, so after the trial started, it took about 3 months and my hair started to grow back. The first things that came back were my eyebrows and my eyelashes and then my scalp hair. And at about 6 months, I remember that my SALT score was 33 and I had started at 100. So I'd gone from 100% loss to 33%, which I thought was fantastic. And in the meantime, I was going every 1 to 3 months for blood tests at the clinic. They would do, every time I went, they would weigh me, they would do my blood pressure, they would do blood tests, and then they would assess my SALT score and ask about any side effects. So then I continued on at the 1 year mark, my SALT score was 24, which I also thought was pretty good. But apparently I didn't meet the endpoint, which was a SALT score of 20. And so I ended up, they put me on placebo after that. So, so then about 6 weeks later, my hair started falling out again. And it continued until, eventually I got to a different dermatologist who could put me on tofacitinib so that I could get my hair started to grow again. But for the year that I was in the baricitinib trial, it was a really good experience. And I really liked my study site and my coordinator and the doctor. They were all just super nice and supportive. And it was overall a great experience. I felt like I was really monitored really well. And I would recommend it for sure.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing all of that. A lot of details in there. SALT score, severity of alopecia tool, is that right, Dr. Mayo? That gives you the amount of hair loss. So 100%, a SALT score of 100 is 100% hair loss. So if Sandy got down to 30, that means she had 30% hair loss. Okay, I want to come back to some of the things you mentioned about placebo and other things, but thanks for sharing that. Okay, April, do you want to go next and tell us a little bit about your trial experience?
Sure. Am I unmuted? Am I good? Okay.
You're good.
So I wasn't really seeking any treatment from like the late 90s to 2010. I had been pretty stable. I'd had really small bald spots that were really manageable. But then after I started having children, the hair loss got a lot worse. And I started wearing wigs in 2005. And I think it was 2015 I first saw JAK inhibitor in an article. And so I started digging. I think I emailed Dr. King. I can't remember for sure, but the response that I got back was just keep watching for more information. So I found the alopecia Facebook group and was reading posts in there and read about how to get signed up for the clinicaltrials.gov emails and the NAF emails. And in late 2019, I saw the email that there was a trial recruiting in Indianapolis. And I read through the information and I reached out to them and got started with the trial. I did do I might say this wrong, ritlecitinib or ritlecitinib.
Mhm.
And I started that trial. It was guaranteed drug in March 2020. And everything went really well with that. I went every 3 months and then every 4 months, traveled to Indy, which is about a 2-hour drive for us for the blood work, things like that. Had to keep the tablets refrigerated, had to do the dosing diary, but it was all a really simple process. And I got so used to the process that even now that I'm not on the trial, I take the pill and I still look for the place to write it down and I go, oh, I don't have to write it down anymore. But the trial just ended in February of this year as the drug was approved by the FDA. And so I've been learning how to navigate insurance approval and all of that. When I started the trial, I was at about 50% hair loss. They were recruiting, you had to have less than 50. And I think that the dermatologist there said I was about 49. So I just barely made the cutoff for that stage of the trial. And the last visit that I had, my SALT score was about 10. So I'm overall really happy with the results, and it's been a really great experience. The clinic there has been fantastic, and it is clear that they take the research really seriously. So I'm thankful for the experience for sure.
Okay, thank you for sharing all of that. Brandy, do you want to tell us how you entered a clinical trial?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I have such a similar story to April, battled it kind of off and on through childhood and adolescence and was able to manage it and even had years, during my teen years with no spots. It seemed that when I hit my 40s, I entered what I refer to as a cat and mouse game. There was always spots that we were chasing, and we'll get into later all the different treatments we've tried. In fall of 2020, I was in such an active phase, and I live in a rural area, and not that there's not great doctors in this area, but I think sometimes the knowledge of clinical trials and what was, happening as far as medication was limited. And I just happened to accept kind of a hybrid job in Louisville, Kentucky. And simultaneously, I was losing, as people can relate to, handfuls of hair left and right. I never went totalis or universalis, but I was probably down close to what I refer to as like a mohawk left. And, when alopecia areata people lose it, it's typically in that area, not uniform, very patchy, spotty, kind of the leopard cheetah look, with some areas that were long and next to areas that had no hair, next to areas that had some spotty hair. So I just thought, well, I'm in a bigger city. There just has to be resources out here. So I randomly picked a dermatology office, and it was to the point where I was wearing a topper and trying some extensions underneath and anything I could to hide and blend it. And I went to a dermatology office thinking, oh, they're just going to come back with something, great, here's what's going to happen. And typically I had, steroid injections had oftentimes been helpful in the past. So when I saw the doctor and took my topper off, they just looked at me and said, oh gosh, you just have so much loss. I really don't think injections are going to help you this time. I don't think we can do enough injections to help you. And I was really at a lowest point and kind of broke down in front of them, which I'd always tried to hide those emotions and stuff. And so the doctor stepped out, and she had mentioned, maybe we could try Xeljanz. Came back in about 10 minutes later, was composed, and she said, I talked to some of my associates. We're really not seeing insurances approve it because it's not approved for alopecia. But she also had a Post-it note in her hand with a phone number on it. And she said, here's the name of another dermatology office in town. And they have a clinical trial, a research division. She goes, give them a call. I've heard that they're going to possibly start a clinical trial. Mind you, this was now in the height of the pandemic. So when we're now to about October, November of 2020. And so I thought, oh, great. She just blown me off, clinical trial. Okay. So I called, left a message, and thought that would be the end of it. And the next day, the nicest nurse, most caring, compassionate, called me and said, we've had to push it back to early 2021 because of the pandemic. Call us after first of the year. And I'm like, oh, are you kidding? Like, I have some hope here. In the meantime, I went back home over Thanksgiving to my local dermatologist. They put a few dozen injections in, to try to stimulate growth. I wasn't sure if I was allowed to, what would happen if I was going to get injections prior to this trial. So late January of 2021, I had my first appointment, and it was, a pretty long appointment. I was super impressed with, the clinical trial nurse in the room and the doctor, and explaining everything and answering my questions. I had a strong family history of cancer. lost a father to lymphoma. My mother was a breast cancer survivor. So, my Google sleuthing didn't bode well for me because I was convinced that I was not going to be a candidate because of those factors. I myself was fairly healthy. So, I didn't have a ton of concerns there. And I was, at that time, I had went from a 75% loss in November to a 54% loss because the steroid injections had stimulated some random patches here and there. The criteria for my trial, which is the CTP 543 trial, also known as duruxolitinib, you had to be more than 50% hair loss. So I was then thankful that the injections didn't work super good because it would have excluded me from it. So if there was ever a time I was thankful that it wasn't working that great, it was then. And there was a chance that I could have been given the placebo and randomized, and no way of knowing. I was in very active shed phase. So I, did, like Sandy mentioned, just a lot of blood work, EKG, physical exam, pictures. I really appreciated the fact that they also had a mental health survey as part of the exam to see really what is the mental health impact that this has on people or their family or parents of, people with alopecia. And all of that came back great with blood work. So 2 weeks later, I went back, started the medication, and within the first week, took a shower one morning, and I didn't have hair coming out, and my fingers, like literally my shedding had stopped within a week. I knew then that I was not on the placebo. So like I said, that was late January of 2021. I am still in the trial. I actually just went yesterday for an appointment, and I signed another extension that takes me through 2026, which I'm super grateful for. So I feel for people that have to get out of the trials and then navigate the world of coverage on their own. So I feel very fortunate.
Well, those are three amazing stories with amazing results that we can all see. There's one question that came in about the drug names, and let's just say them now, and then we can, I don't really want to make this about specific medications, but Sandy, you were in the baricitinib trial, which is Olumiant. April, you were in the ritlecitinib trial, which is Litfulo, and Brandy, you are in the duruxolitinib trial, which does not have a commercial name yet, but we think that there's a strong likelihood that it will be approved sometime soon this year, and then we'll know a commercial name. So thank you all for sharing those. It's amazing to hear and see your success. It's great. So now, Katie, as we said earlier, you are in a different boat because you are a parent, and so you've not made, or you're thinking about this not for yourself, but for someone else. So can you tell us sort of your story and what's going on in your family?
Sure. Absolutely. So my youngest daughter, who will be 10 this August, was diagnosed with alopecia areata at the age of 6 in the 1st grade, and lost her hair pretty much from October to Christmas. And so for about, I know you asked for kind of impact on our family, right? So it was hard. It was hardest when she was losing. And then we have found that once she lost all of her hair, she was so confident, and really just it was easier on all of us to see her walk around kind of in her authentic self, right? So she wore a wig for her first 2 years of diagnosis to school, but did not like to wear a wig outside of school. And her biggest concern as a 8 and 9-year-old has been her loss of eyelashes. She really doesn't care about any other hair. And so from a parent perspective, it's this balance of respecting her wishes and also recognizing that she may not always feel this way. And for those that have been in trials or those that are familiar with the research, there is a time frame that at a certain point in time, the recommendation is that you at least kind of restart the follicles, right? And I believe it's between 5 and 8 years, at least that's what I remember from last summer's conference. And so that weighs on me as a parent because we're approaching the 4th year. She is a strong-willed young lady and really has no interest in hair at this very moment. And so we did talk to a clinical nurse, and she is technically enrolled in a trial that would be in Indianapolis, and they had to push it because her age group is 6 to 11 years. And so they weren't quite finished compiling the 12 to 17-year-olds. And so instead of starting January of 24, they're starting January of 25. So we kind of have this extra time to talk with her about, she's really interested in being a part of science. She thinks that's neat, but she has no interest in hair. And so that is the unique balance of being a parent, right? Because I have to, although my choice for her might be different, I'm trying to currently respect, her wishes and her journey too. And so that's the balance that we're playing in our house. And I will say that my husband is a little concerned about long-term effects given that she's so young.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that's challenging and a lot to think through. I know it's probably lots of things that we can talk about, but I want to give Dr. Mayo a chance to share her perspective as a principal investigator in clinical trials and some other things that she hears from patients.
Yeah. So again, thank you all. My role as a principal investigator has really been an interesting one. I really get to be an advocate for the science of understanding alopecia and different types of alopecia, but certainly alopecia areata. an advocate for better treatments, for this condition. And I really get to counsel patients, talk to patients, offer hope. I think someone may have mentioned that type of feeling when they heard that there's a clinical trial, or when someone called them for a clinical trial. So it is a very rewarding opportunity for me to be a principal investigator. So what that means is, so every clinical trial, and there were some terms, I was trying to jot them down that you may have heard, and so I wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page. But basically, a clinical trial is basically a research design with a medication intervention. And so I think we're all kind of on the same page here. And so here, everyone has been in a trial where there is a medication used to treat alopecia areata, but some people may have mentioned placebo. And so some trials are designed where there is a component where you're not receiving active intervention or active drug. You're receiving a pill, but it's not the actual medication. And so trials are designed that way so that the company, sometimes the FDA, likes it to be that way to prove that the medication itself is actually what is working. So oftentimes when patients are involved in a trial with the placebo, they are switched over to the active drug group at some point, or sometimes, depending on the disease state and how long the trial is, one group will remain on placebo. But that's kind of something that has been mentioned. And another thing someone mentioned was randomized. And so randomized means assigned. Which group are you randomly assigned to, or the placebo group, or a specific dose? Sometimes there's different doses of medication. So okay, so that kind of gets us all on the same page. I think those were the main things. But so as a principal investigator, so I'm the lead physician at our institution for the particular clinical trial. And so I get to talk to my clinical patients about alopecia, all the different treatment options, including the clinical trial. And then I get to oversee the clinical trial portion. So the concerns from my patients have been very much what has been shared here today. So sometimes there's reservation when you talk about a clinical trial. Some patients have reservations, particularly related to, well, what is it like to be in a clinical trial? Will I be on placebo? Am I healthy enough? What are the side effects? How will I be monitored? So these are things that often will come up when I'm talking to patients about clinical trials, and what are the risk-benefit ratio? Those are kind of some of the main things. Now, some of the concerns, as a physician and a principal investigator, I want to make sure that we are offering an opportunity for patients, as well as for science, right? And so I think it depends on the patient population when we talk about what are some of the concerns. And so like Katie, mentioned, like speaking about the pediatric age group, well, not every patient experiences a condition in the same way. So we can't assume that medications that have been trialed in an adult population will work exactly the same or have the same side effect profile in another population like the pediatric population, but also different genders, different age group, different races and ethnicities. So diversity in clinical trials is something that is very important to me. And so I think some of the hesitancy sometimes comes with age group or comes with different patient populations. Like specifically, one of my interests is skin of color, and that is a patient group that has had low enrollment in clinical trials for various reasons. So when we talk about there's a historical aspect of clinical trials that, does give just reason for concern. And so a lot of my counseling related to clinical trials is explaining how clinical trials work, what are the safety parameters for the patient that are built into the different kind of legal aspects of running a clinical trial. Who reviews this? There's committees at institutions that review it to make sure that the trials are fair, for all patients, and that we have to follow, certain rules and guidelines. And so those are some of the things that as a principal investigator, I make sure to explain really to all patients, but then also make sure I'm offering the trial, to all patients, and not assuming that some patients will be hesitant and not interested. And so it really gives me joy to hear that Many of the patients on the panel were offered a clinical trial opportunity, even though it wasn't necessarily the principal investigator, or the physician that they were seeing was not the principal investigator. I think it's important to know that trials are therapeutic options sometimes. So there are opportunities, even though there may be no benefit to the patient, there may be, benefit to the patient, or the patient may want to be, as Katie said, our daughter wants to be a part of science and improving the outcomes for the future. So understanding just what motivates patients, what drive patients, and the potential for treating a disease, right now and in the future. Those are things that, really kind of are fulfill me really as a physician and a principal investigator. And so I won't belabor some of the things that the panelists have said, but I definitely am happy to really go into more detail based on the questions that the audience members may have.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I've been sneaking a peek at the questions, and we'll probably do most of them closer to the end. But one question that's come up, and I want to ask you first, Dr. Mayo, and then ask the panel. Safety monitoring and side effects. What is the process when you're, as an investigator in a trial, for monitoring and addressing side effects? And then I'm going to ask the panel about their experiences with that.
So the first thing is, well, I'll tell you clinically. So clinically for alopecia areata, there's not been FDA approved actual treatments. Most of what we were doing was off label, methotrexate, someone had mentioned, all of these things have been off label. And so typically when we start someone on a medication, whether it's a topical or an oral, we see them back maybe in 3 months. So there's 12 weeks, period that has passed. Maybe we get a lab work, the first 1 or 2 weeks, or maybe not, for some, physicians. And so what I'd like to kind of acknowledge for clinical trials is that before someone even is enrolled or able to enroll in a clinical trial, there's a screening. And so the screening is a very thorough review, not only of the patient's medical history and sometimes their family history, but also blood work, EKG. Someone kind of mentioned some of the more thorough things that are done to make sure that a patient is healthy enough to participate in the clinical trial. And it's not, so clinically, we do some things that are similar, but clinical trials have very stringent criteria related to, who can participate. So they want to make sure that they're enrolling patients who don't have risk factors that may have poor outcomes. Then patients, once they actually start active treatment, there is follow-up, usually week 1 or week 2. There's several follow-ups within the first 12 weeks of being on a drug for a clinical trial. And at these follow-ups, patients are getting assessed by the physician. They're also getting blood work. So there's a lot more monitoring within a clinical trial, even more so than what is considered standard practice for, on-label or off-label drug in the dermatology clinic. And so I'll kind of stop there and kind of, I guess, let the panelists say what their experience was with that compared to what they typically had experienced when they started an oral medication.
Brandy, do you want to go first, or did you experience side effects, and how was the monitoring of that?
So as far as monitoring, in the beginning, I went every 2 weeks for, I think, the first 2 months, and then I would go monthly after that. And after about the first year or so, when I entered what's known as the maintenance phase, where the active portion of the trial is over, then I was switched to bi-monthly. And so that's what I continue on as I go every other month, and we do blood work. Occasionally, depending on the phase they're in, I may have to repeat the EKG, but it's definitely less time-consuming appointments. So, they take my vitals, of course, blood pressure, heart rate every time. Ask me, have you, any new medications you're on? How have you been feeling? So, keep track of my medical conditions and medical history. As far as side effects, I did have a slight increase in cholesterol, especially my low density lipoproteins or the LDLs, and I had some weight gain. I've since started on weight loss medication for that, which has worked. My March labs showed that my LDLs were now back down to just 5 points over the high end of normal range. My triglycerides are perfect. My HDLs are in great levels, and took the weight off. So other than that, I've had absolutely no adverse side effects, other than best side effect of all was what I call getting my life back.
Thank you. Sandy, anything that you want to share? No, of course, these are our wonderful volunteers. So this is personal information. Anything you don't want to share, obviously you don't have to share. But if there's anything you want to say about anything that you experienced, like your care, your monitoring, and any side effects that you experienced in your trial.
Well, my trial was monthly, so I went every month for all the vitals and the blood work. And then like midway through the trial, there were a couple of periods there where I went like every other month instead. So otherwise it was monthly. When I first started the medication, I felt no different. Like I felt exactly the same. Like I couldn't tell if I was on placebo or the real drug. Until a couple weeks later, I started getting oily skin. And that, made me have some acne. That lasted for about 3 months and then it cleared up. Besides that, the only other thing was I had an increase in cholesterol. But now I'm on, since I'm off of that trial now, and there are 2 FDA approved medications, now I'm on Litfulo, and I don't have any increase in cholesterol with that one.
Okay, thank you. April, any side effects, or how was your monitoring during your trial?
My monitoring was really, really similar to Brandy's. By the time I got to just a few months ago in February, I was only having visits every 4 months. At the beginning of the trial, I had to have a chest x-ray, and I think I had the EKG twice a year. And then twice a year, I also had a hearing screening, which to me, with being a musician and having a family history of hearing loss, that was great to be able to have that hearing screening just as an added, just really kind of a bonus. Like you're hearing really just fine. So that monitoring was easy. The blood work, some of the appointments were longer than others. There was one that was, you would dose and then you would have blood work and then you would dose and then you would have some more blood work repeated that same appointment. But that was really only one appointment out of 20 plus appointments that felt lengthy, felt like the whole day. And then as far as side effects, kind of like Sandy mentioned, I had some acne right at the beginning. I still notice kind of phases of, I feel like it's a phase of hair growth where I'll get almost like acne in a couple spots, and then I'll notice kind of a surge in hair regrowth. Even after 4 years, it's still changing and regrowing different ways. And I haven't had any weight gain. My cholesterol is a little bit elevated, but I noticed the last time that I looked at my labs online, my bad cholesterol is actually a little bit lower now than it was 2 years ago, with not really any changes in anything targeted at the cholesterol. So other than that, I haven't really had any side effects at all.
Okay, that's interesting. Dr. Mayo, question for you. Can you talk a little bit about the drugs that are tested in clinical trials? Could it be something brand new? Could it be something that's already approved for something else?
Yeah, sometimes it's something brand new, but clinical trials, and before something can be approved for a particular indication, even if it's approved for something else, it has to go through a clinical trial to show that it's effective for whatever indication we're wanting to get it approved for. And so a lot of times, especially in dermatology, we will use medications off label that have worked for other things, for instance, for alopecia, and then we may realize, okay, this is helpful. Sponsors kind of become aware because we start doing investigator-initiated trials showing that it works, or we may write case reports saying, hey, this medication for atopic dermatitis also helped my patient with whatever, condition or alopecia. And so then a company or a sponsor may decide, oh, let's do a large trial to show and seek FDA approval for this medication also, for this separate indication. And so as a physician, I think it was Sandy mentioned tofacitinib, wanting to get tofacitinib, but our doctor said that's a great idea, but unfortunately your insurance won't approve it. And so that's kind of the situation that we're often in. We may know that something could work, and it's for good reason, so here the FDA has to approve a medication, and there are strict rules related to medications being approved. So I think maybe it was you, Sandy, also who mentioned that the endpoint in your trial for success said that you had to have regrown back a certain amount of hair, and you were just shy of that, and so you didn't meet the endpoint. So that was considered somewhat of a failure, though for you, it was fantastic, right? So these rules are very strict rules. So when something is FDA approved, you can have some confidence that it, had to meet some very strict rules and criteria. So it's for good cause. But back to the point of the clinical trials, in order for something to get FDA approved, it has to undergo a clinical trial for that indication. And insurance typically won't approve a medication unless it's FDA approved, or unless a patient has tried multiple other things and there's several case reports in the literature showing that it works. So there has to be an exception made. And so not all medications are brand new that are being tested in clinical trials, which I'd love to kind of talk about the different phases of clinical trials if this is a good time to do that. Okay, so everyone here was talking about a phase 3 clinical trial that they were in. At least I think everyone was talking about a phase 3 clinical trial that they were in. But there are different phases of trials. I have a little, okay, so to give you an idea, so a phase 1 trial. So this is a trial to show that a drug is safe. And so that would be a very small number of people, healthy people, not necessarily, not with the condition that they are testing for efficacy, because those aren't looking for, is it effective? Those are just healthy people. We want to know, is this drug safe for human, intake? And then a phase 2 trial. So now that is going to be more people. They want to know, is it safe? That's always kind of one of the criteria. Is this safe? But then also, does this work? And so this may be the indication or the disease we're trying to study, but it's still a small number of people because we're still checking to see, is it safe and does it work? And then the phase 3 trial, these are the ones where it's larger number of people with the condition that we want to see if it works. We're looking for any safety signals, and also, is it effective? And so this is also where we really want a diverse patient pool. We want different age ranges. We want males, females. We want different ethnicities. We want to see, does something work faster here? Or is there a certain, safety signal? Is there something that shows up, for this medication? But also, is it effective in everyone? And so, so there are different phases of clinical trials. And so not every, one of the concerns that patients have is, oh no, has this ever been tested in humans? Will I be a lab rat? This kind of thing comes up a lot. And so oftentimes though, in dermatology, we've already had experience with these types of medications for other conditions. So tofacitinib, for instance, has been used in the rheumatoid arthritis patient population. And so that is kind of how we discovered that it can be helpful in alopecia areata. And so that's where we moved from. So often in derm, these aren't brand new medications. These are medicines approved for other things that we're trying to get approved on label and covered by insurance for alopecia. There are some new ones though. So that's the exciting thing. New things are coming, and that's what we want to happen.
Right. And the only way that we can get new things is by having them go through this kind of clinical trial testing. So
right.
You don't really know entering a clinical trial if it's going to be successful.
Right.
we don't have a panel diversity here in terms of clinical trial experience because you all had positive outcomes from that, but it's possible that you're in a placebo group, maybe you're not seeing a response for a while until you go on a treatment arm, or that it's something really new and it doesn't work as well as something that.
Right. I'll add, at the phase 2, if the drug isn't showing to be effective, it won't go on to a phase 3. And so a lot of drugs will make it to a phase 2 trial, but never make it for FDA approval because it didn't show that it was effective in enough people, or it'll show that it's effective, but there was a safety signal that popped up in, a number of people, and then that trial won't ever make it, or that drug won't ever make it to market for that indication. In trials, even in the alopecia areata trials, though we are, ecstatic about the new medications that are available, not every single patient responded. And we want to understand why that is too. But that's also the reason it's important to have medications that work in different ways. And so having new drugs come out is a fantastic thing because not everyone responds. Some people lose response. And so, so I think, those are important things that are important to consider about clinical trials. So even if someone was in a clinical trial or was on a medication that, worked and didn't work, or that did not work at all, I think having hope about clinical trials, you should still consider other clinical trials, because even medications within the same class, which means, for instance, right now we're talking about JAK inhibitors. Sometimes if someone doesn't respond to one JAK inhibitor, it doesn't mean they won't respond to another one, even though they work in a very similar way. And so I hope that even those patients that haven't had good success in the past will remain hopeful, because there are several different types of medications coming in the pipeline.
Okay, great. I want to keep the conversation going, and boy, we're quickly running out of time. And people in the audience, please, I see you're already submitting questions, but please put them in the Q&A if you have questions for the panel. One question that is here it's kind of personal, but I will ask it, and if you don't want to answer, don't answer. It was addressed to Brandy, but ask everybody. Brandy, is that your own hair?
Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't have no extensions, no toppers, anything. Definitely grateful, and has worked for me. That being said, I did have, after about the first year mark, I did have a few breakthrough spots that seemed to show back up in my trouble areas above my ear. You can see it's covered well, some hair that's now since grown back, but I had some spots above my ears, widow's peak here, and one random spot here. Being in the trial, I couldn't add extra things. I couldn't go for my backup rescue steroid injections or add minoxidil or anything. So I waited them out. And after about 6 to 8 months, they all started those growing back in. So when you say a SALT score is 0, meaning no loss, my dermatologist jokes that I'm like -1,000, because she's like, you have so much hair, I can't get through all of it to even know if there are any spots. So yeah, it's my own.
Okay. In April, Sandy, do you want to answer that question, or you don't have to?
I can. Yeah, this is my own hair, and I didn't know what ophiasis was until I started the trial. And like Brandy said, I am a little thin here, but not any active spots. But it is all different stages of growth too. So I have one part pinned down because it's only this long, and with the natural curl, it just likes to go out like that. But I'm grateful for it. And yeah, 15 years of trial and error with wigs, and I had just gotten to where I was comfortable with them, but it's much more comfortable not wearing one.
Thank
And
you.
mine, yeah, I'm not wearing anything, and my hair has never gotten to 100% regrowth. So it's not as thick as it was, before I lost it, but it's enough for me to be able to go out without a head covering or without a wig or anything. So
Okay, that's great.
that's good. It's fine for me.
I want to bring it back a little bit to your thinking as you were considering a clinical trial, and this applied to you, Katie, as well, for your daughter. Can you remember back like, what were your concerns going into it? I mean, because at the time you probably didn't know what was going to happen. April, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was pretty apprehensive. I printed the 47-page document and kind of went through it. And I saw a lot of,
What is that? The 40-page document just explaining the trial.
yeah, it was the whole, I can't think of the term for it, but it was just all the documentation that I was going to have to sign at the first appointment. And
Informed consent.
yes, yeah. Thank you. And then I just kind of sought a lot of support from family and friends, kind of, do you think that it is too risky to do this? And some people really thought that it was pretty risky, but at the end of the day, I had to decide to just give it a shot. I did not know. I'm in a pretty rural area too, and I didn't know anybody who'd ever been on a clinical trial, so it was kind of a mysterious process, but it's been pretty easy. It's been step by step walking me through each part. So it's been really positive.
Thank you. Sandy or Brandy, whoever's ready, if you can remember back to concerns that you had, or
I really, I was really ready to go for it. I'd read so much about JAK inhibitors that I had kind of, I'd gone through a lot of scientific papers and on rheumatoid arthritis and especially tofacitinib, because that's where most of the research was at that time. And I had come to the conclusion that these were really quite safe, and especially for a healthy person like myself, I really didn't have any concerns by the time I started, and I was just really excited.
Yeah, and same for me. I was at such a low point mentally. I'd spent my whole life trying to hide this condition, sometimes being ashamed that I felt guilty about it because I would hear things from people like it's just hair or you're not dying from it. So then I had guilt over it, and guilt for years that it was myself causing this condition, from stress or whatever, eating, not eating. And I had literally, like Sandy, tried everything, thousands of cortisone injections, dozens times of prednisone, oral steroid blast, methotrexate, Plaquenil, DCPC, which burnt and left scabs all over my head and ears, every shampoo, conditioner, ointment, supplement, you name it, I tried it. And being at such a low point, I thought, well, if they've investigated it this far, I'll see what happens, and did some research like Sandy, and had been told because of a family history from prior dermatologists that you're not a candidate. And my first meeting with the doctor and the nurse was so incredible and so reassuring that I had no qualms going forward after that first appointment.
thank you. Katie, you're still in that position of thinking about it and thinking about it for your
Sure.
daughter.
Yeah, I think it's important for parents to hear the debate, right? Because you're not making a decision for yourself, whereas an adult, this is about you. And so in our family, I'm very much not a skeptic. So I believe in science. My mom has her PhD in nursing. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a decade. So I'm like, let's go. Let's do this. But then I have to also, take into account how my husband feels and his concerns, and obviously our daughter, and what is it that she wants. And her biggest concern is blood work, and that she can't just have eyelashes and eyebrows. So I've told her science is not quite that smart yet. That if we grow hair, we grow it everywhere. But it's a different kind of decision process from a parent perspective, because I feel like there are more players. So I have fewer concerns than the rest of my family, but theirs are legitimate.
Okay. I want to try to get through some questions. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. Dr. Mayo, is it always common for trials to share the results of all testing, like blood and hair biopsy results, with patients?
Actually, the individual biopsy results, the principal investigator will share that with you. Now, every time your labs come back, the physician will review your labs. They may not always tell you all of the results, but if there's anything that comes back concerning, they will discuss it with you. Oftentimes they may get your primary doctor involved. For instance, some of you mentioned high cholesterol or different labs. So every lab protocol, meaning the instructions and parameters for how that how that trial has to be run. It also has like a guardrails for what is okay labs outside, how far outside of normal, can they be? And then, can you start a medication for a particular thing and remain in the trial? And so often we'll work with a primary physician, but we're always, usually we'll share those labs with the person's primary physician, especially if anything comes back outside of a normal range. So yes, they're available. Oftentimes we will tell the patient up front, but unless something is abnormal, some investigators, will just say your labs are normal.
Okay. A couple of questions just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Do you need to have health insurance to be in a clinical trial, Dr. Mayo?
Nope. No, you don't need to have health insurance to be in a clinical trial. Often clinical trials will actually provide some form of reimbursement or compensation for the time, travel, for participating in the clinical trial. And so nothing is usually charged to insurance. It's very rare. Sometimes if something is standard of care, a few trials will kind of use what someone has already had in terms of labs, but most clinical trials, everything they do is outside of what your insurance would be expected to cover.
Okay. There's a question here about, it's for the panelists. Maybe you can do quick answers and then Dr. Mayo comment. Are your concerns, or what happened at the end of your trial about obtaining medication at the end of once your trial is over? Especially in your cases where you've had hair regrowth. Brandy, you're still in the trial, you said, right? Okay, people are asking, so you were in the duruxolitinib, you're still in the duruxolitinib trial.
Correct.
So you're still getting drug through your trial.
Yes.
Sandy, what was your experience?
So when my trial ended, nothing had been approved yet, so I had to wait a bit. I did go on tofacitinib for a little bit until baricitinib was approved, and then I went on that and my insurance covered it. And then eventually I ended up switching to ritlecitinib when that became approved, and my insurance is covering that as well.
In April?
I found a dermatologist closer to home, and she was excited to get to see somebody that was on one of the trials. And she has continued, she started my prescription for ritlecitinib so that I wouldn't miss any doses once the trial ended. And I'm still learning the system. I just put in my refill. I think it's my second or third time getting it refilled on CVS Specialty a little bit ago. And I'm still learning the process, but so far I haven't had to pay any copay at all. So I've been successful with that.
Okay. It's hard to believe, but we're at the top of the hour. Before we totally wrap up, I've asked Dr. Mayo to talk to us just for a second about what's coming in the clinical trial pipeline.
This is so exciting. Okay. So there are trials, and you can see this here. So there are two drugs that are approved, baricitinib and ritlecitinib. And so those are the ones that are FDA approved. You can be prescribed this now. But what's very exciting is that there's two drugs in the phase 3 that you can see. There are 9 drugs in phase 2 right now. And there's even one drug kind of in the preclinical stage. So more of the phase 1 or even more preclinical than that. And so there's several drugs. These are all very exciting. If you notice, not all of them are JAK inhibitors. So some of them work in different ways that we have kind of started to learn through investigating more about understanding how alopecia areata work, the inflammatory pathways related to alopecia. We're now trying to target different areas. And so hopefully we'll have multiple different medications that work in different ways so that they can best suit the differences in our patient population. And so this is very exciting.
That is exciting. And thank you for talking about all that. I mean, I think, the future is really bright. That's what Dr. Brett King has said on some of these webinars before. that slide came from him, so thanks to him for that. That's what we hope for the community is multiple effective treatments, different pathways, so that everybody has lots of options in treatment development. I am going to talk a little bit in a second about how to find out about clinical trials, but before that, I want to say thank you so much to this great panel. Thank you for being here and taking time to talk to the community, and really thank you for everything that you've done, because and that you will do, Katie, with your family. You know, really, this is how we will get new treatments. You guys are treatment pioneers. You've helped contribute to the treatments that we have right now that are approved, and for the future, you've helped us learn more about the disease, and you're helping us broaden what the availability of treatments for everybody. So thank you so much. I applaud all of you. And I'm going to wrap up and share my screen again. I know we've had questions about how to find out about clinical trials, and I want to talk about that for a second. There are some resources listed here. You're all going to get a recording of this webinar, so you can come back and look at this information. One source is clinicaltrials.gov. Now, this is a searchable online database that's hosted by the National Library of Medicine that lists all kinds of clinical trials in the US and around the world. It can be a little tricky to search it, but it's possible to search for trials that are happening now, trials that are recruiting now, trials that have happened in the past, trials that will be coming in the future. NAF has developed some other resources to sort of help you navigate that a little bit more easily. So on the naf.org/studies page, you will find listings of clinical trials that are currently recruiting for alopecia areata. And we've also developed a guide to using clinicaltrials.gov that'll give you some tips for how to search there for clinical trials. We also have a clinical trials and you worksheet that will give you some questions that you might want to ask your doctor if you are considering a clinical trial. If you're looking for more information about clinical trials and some of the details that came up on this webinar about like trial phases and some of the language that's used around clinical trials, we have an older webinar that's available on our website that's called The Patient Guide to Clinical Trials and Drug Development. It was presented by Danielle Quarles, who's the Director of Clinical Operations for Sana Biotechnology, and she herself is a parent of children with alopecia areata. So that's another good resource to learn more about clinical trials in general. And of course, if you have questions, please email us at info@naf.org, and we will do our best to help you. Another consideration is to talk to your dermatologist or find a dermatologist who's knowledgeable about alopecia areata from our doctor finder. Dr. Mayo is one of the doctors listed there. And as you heard, she is a principal investigator, and there are other principal investigators and dermatologists involved with clinical trials listed on the doctor finder. So that's another way that you may be able to get connected. Okay, so thanks again to our fabulous panel, and thank you to everybody in the audience who is here with us tonight. We thank you for joining us, and we'd love to hear your feedback on today's webinar so we can plan future presentations. A link to a short survey will pop up in your browser window at the end of the webinar, and we really appreciate your feedback. The NAF Patient Conference is just around the corner, and Dr. Mayo will be there as well. It would be great to have you there to hear her presentation at our 39th annual conference. The conference is taking place in Washington, D.C. on June 27th through June 30th. It's the largest gathering of the alopecia areata community in the world, and you are all invited. It's your opportunity to hear from leading experts in alopecia areata like Dr. Mayo and Dr. Brett King. You will also hear personal stories from our speakers like Joelle Crawford and Emmy-winning broadcaster Aziza Shuler, as well as meet others living with alopecia areata. So we hope to see you there, and you can register using that QR code on this slide. And then our next webinar, we hope you will join us for a community panel discussion on the impact of alopecia areata on family members and how to support those affected. So alopecia areata affects not only the individual with hair loss, but also family members. Watching a loved one go through this disease can be emotionally challenging, and it may leave family members feeling helpless. However, there are multiple ways in which family members can support those affected by alopecia areata. With this webinar, you can discover what others have found most helpful as they navigate life with alopecia. Please join us on the webinar to ask your questions and learn from other community members. Jonelle Massey is a licensed medical health therapist and a parent of an alopecia areata princess, and she's going to lead the discussion, and we will be announcing our other panelists soon. This webinar will take place on Thursday, June 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, and registration for this webinar is open now. And don't forget that we have lots of resources for you at naf.org, our support groups, our youth mentor program, the Doctor Finder that we mentioned, of course, news and other webinar links, and you can learn how to get involved. So to learn more about NAF and the resources we offer, please visit naf.org or email us at support@naf.org. And this concludes today's webinar program. Thank you for hanging out with me a little past the hour and for being here with us. And thanks again to our panelists. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Bye, everyone.